Today, we want to talk about the powers of the presidency. So, in this chapter 6, we have been looking at the office of the president and we've been looking at different things. Well, today we want to specifically discuss the powers of the presidency. Um, Remember, the president has certain powers that are official, that are laid out in the Constitution that he or she can do. And then we also have the powers that are unofficial, things that just have happened over time or that just happened by the nature of the power that comes with being the president. So remember to, as you go through and take the notes, that you put in your notes anything on the screen that is in red, and make sure that you submit it for a grade when you finish, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, let's go ahead and consider the first question that's in your notes. What are the executive powers of the president? Now let's talk about that for just a minute. Remember that the president is the chief executive. That is one of his duties. That's one of the things he does. That means that the president's job is to execute the laws. In other words, the Constitution says faithfully execute the laws of the land. In other words, his job is to make sure that those laws are implemented and enforced. He also has certain other things that he's able to do to help him enforce those. So those are his executive powers. So what are some of these executive powers of the president? Well, the first thing that we look at is that he has appointment and removal powers. That means that he appoints people to certain positions and he can remove people from certain positions. Now, he appoints the justices. That's not part of his executive powers. That's a different kind of power that he has. But he can appoint the heads of the departments, which are known as his cabinet members, like the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, those kind of things. He also appoints the Postmaster General. He appoints the director of the FBI, the director of the CIA. He appoints all of those people. And what he does is he appoints those people so that they can then execute the laws, because each particular executive department and each agency, whether it be, like the FCC, the Federal Communications Agency, for instance, is not under one of the cabinet members, and it's pretty independent. But the president appoints certain members of the FCC, and they control communications. They make sure that things are regulated the way they're supposed to. So he appoints these people so that the laws can be faithfully executed. That's why it's called executive powers. And the president has the power to remove those in most cases. There are some that probably can't be removed. He can't remove justices, but remember, that's not an executive power. That's something else. The second one we look at is executive orders. Well, how does the president execute the laws? What he does is, once the law has been passed by Congress and signed by the president, it becomes a law, the president then writes an executive order, which is meant to instruct his people in his departments, whichever departments are in charge of that particular item or issue, to execute that law and how to do so. Now, I will say that over the last several presidencies, and you can really go back to George W. Bush, but even before that, but especially since George W. Bush and following, presidents have used executive orders a great deal more liberally than they used to the point that now they oftentimes will issue an executive order ordering their officials not to enforce certain laws, which I submit is not constitutional. But that hasn't been challenged to this point, at least not successfully. The president often has in times, presidents in the last few years have often implemented executive orders that have the force of law that really are not really laws. And so that has become a power that they have used quite a bit more frequently than normal, and for reasons other than what is really intended for. But that is one of his executive powers. Executive privilege. Executive privilege is the power that allows the president to refuse to release information to Congress or a court. And the reason for that is because release of that information could compromise national security. And so the president will often claim executive privilege when he or she does not want Congress or the courts to have certain information. And so they will claim executive privilege. And that, of course, that power is often disputed by the other branches. And usually when the president claims it related to Congress, Congress will take it to court, and the courts will decide whether or not the president has that power in that particular instance. There was a situation when Nixon was president and the Watergate investigation was in full swing, and the Congress asked for these tapes that had been of recordings in the White House in the Oval Office. And Nixon did not want to release those. He claimed executive privilege. So the Congress sued him, and it went to the Supreme Court. It was United States versus Nixon, 1974. And in the end, the Supreme Court decided that they decided that the president did not have executive privilege in that situation. The reason that's important is because it established limits to executive privilege that had not been given before. It also established limits to presidential immunity, and those limits are still recognized today. Okay, now we're moving on to question number 2. What are the diplomatic and military powers of the president? Now remember, diplomatic refers to how we relate to other countries, diplomacy, that kind of stuff. So what are the diplomatic powers of the president? Because remember, the president, one of his duties is the chief foreign policy leader. Congress can do some things related to foreign policy, but not much. The president primarily deals with foreign policy with other countries. And so what are some of his diplomatic powers? He can negotiate treaties. So he can make a treaty with a nation or several other nations, and they'll often do that related to trade agreements or peace treaties or mutual defense treaties, those kind of things. He can make executive agreements. Now remember, treaties must be confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate. So unless it's just something that's popular, the Senate's not going to confirm it. And so what often happens is they make executive agreements. And here's a good example. President Obama, when he was negotiating the treaty, the agreement, it wasn't a treaty, the agreement with Iran, he knew that 2/3 of the Senate would never approve his agreement. And so he made it as an executive agreement, which means that it could then have to implement it. It would have to pass through Congress like a law, but it would only take a simple majority, not a 2/3 majority in the Senate. And so sometimes they make executive agreements when they know they can't get enough votes in the Senate, and that'll still have a pretty powerful effect. There's some question as to whether that's constitutional because the Constitution does not really recognize that authority. And then the president also has the power to grant diplomatic recognition. In other words, if a government comes to power in a country, the president can recognize that government or not recognize that government. In other words, give that government legitimacy or not. And here's an example. In 1949, the communists in China overthrew the nationalist government of China. The nationalist government fled to Taiwan and set up the government there. And from 1949 until 1972, our country did not recognize the communist government in mainland China as a legitimate government. We recognized the nationalist government in Taiwan as a legitimate government. But in 1972, President Nixon granted recognition to mainland China. And the reason that's important to the Communist Party government in mainland China, the reason that's important is then it opened up relations with us so that we could then trade with them and other things. Okay? It's military powers. Now remember, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. And his role in his powers as the military leader is to ensure the defense and the security of the nation and its interests around the world. The president must make sure that we are safe, that our borders are safe, that our country is safe. If we have interests in other parts of the world, that those are safe as well, and that's his responsibility. The president must take military action or can take military action without a formal declaration of war. Of course, the War Powers Act, and that's what it says, limited by the War Powers Resolution, which most presidents claim is not constitutional. But the War Powers Resolution limits how much the president can do without congressional authorization. But the president can take military action without a formal declaration of war if needed. In fact, we've only declared war 5 times in our history. That would be the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. Every other conflict we've ever been in has not been an official declaration of war. Okay, number 3, how does the president exercise legislative and judicial power? Remember, legislative means lawmaking. How does the president exercise legislative power? Well, he gives the State of the Union address. The Constitution mandates that the president must every year give an annual message to Congress related to the State of the Union. And it doesn't have to be given as a speech, but in the last 100 years, that's the way it's been done. The purpose of the State of the Union is to let Congress know what's going on in the country, how things are faring, and to propose an agenda, something that they should be striving for, that he wants them to push for. The president has the legal responsibility since the 1970s to propose a federal budget. The president has the authority to propose legislation to Congress. They don't have to accept it, but he can ask them to look at it and consider it. The president works with legislators, that would be the congressmen, representatives, and senators, on setting congressional agendas, and the president can veto a bill if he doesn't like it. What judicial powers does the president have? Well, the president nominates federal judges and justices. The difference between a judge and a justice is this: a justice is on the Supreme Court and a judge is on a lower court. Okay, and so that's just the only difference. The president can grant reprieves, pardons, amnesty, and commutations. Well, let's talk about what those are. A reprieve is an order from the president that postpones the carrying out of a sentence or the length of the time a person is put in jail. In other words, that's often done to give them time to consider other issues. So they might be given a hold off. In other words, if the person has sentenced to be executed, the president can grant a reprieve and postpone the execution in case there's some new evidence that has come forward, and that way they can then have a chance to look at that evidence before they go ahead and execute the person. The president can pardon someone if they commit a crime or have been accused of committing a crime or have potentially committed a crime. The president can just pardon them for that. Amnesty would be granting a whole group of people pardons for offenses committed. And it's like a general pardon for a whole group of people. And they can also commute a sentence. That means reduce a person's sentence. So President Obama, I remember there was someone who had been sentenced to like 50 years in jail and they had been in the military for getting information, selling information to enemies. And he commuted their sentence so that it ended after a couple of years rather than after the 50. So the presidents can do that as well. What are some of the informal powers of the president? Well, the president has the ability to command media attention, and that is very important. If the president has command of the media attention, then he or she has a way of getting to the public very easily and very quickly and influencing the public to come to his point of view. Congress people don't have that same kind of attention like the president would. The president is the leader of his or her party. We talked about that already. And as a result of him being the leader of his or her party, he sets that party's agenda. In other words, what the party is going to promote and pursue is set by the president. Number 5, how are the president's powers checked by the other branches? Remember, we have one of the constitutional principles that we have is that each branch of government has a check and a balance on other branches. So when a president vetoes a bill, Congress can override that veto. It has to have a two-thirds majority. Two-thirds majority. I'm getting my numbers confused. Two-thirds majority to override the presidential veto. It's not easy to do that. The Senate can block appointments for many top positions. So let's say the president appoints somebody to be the Secretary of State, and enough senators oppose that nomination. They can block that and require the president to put someone else there rather than accepting the one that's there. The Senate can reject treaties negotiated by the president. I think it was Bill Clinton that negotiated a treaty on gun control with other countries, maybe through the United Nations, and our Senate refused to sign on to that treaty. They don't have to accept the treaty. The presidential actions are subject to judicial review. In other words, if the president, let's say, submits an executive order and someone challenges that executive order in the courts, the judges can say it's unconstitutional and reject that. Okay. Number 6, in what ways has presidential power changed over the years? Well, the first thing you need to understand, it has increased. If you go back to really the turn of the 1900s, turn of the 20th century, really the presidential power began to expand then. But then in the 1920s, it kind of receded a little bit because those presidents were not really very active as far as they didn't believe in the president having too much power. But starting with the Great Depression in the 1930s, the government began to grow tremendously under Franklin Roosevelt in his New Deal program, and it has not stopped growing since. But it has increased as the government has expanded because of reforms, because of war, because of Congress granting the president more power, and as we've become a more powerful nation around the world, that has increased presidential power. All right, that's all we have for this lesson. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. Make sure that you submit your notes for a grade. I hope you have a good day.